Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for coming. So today I'm going to talk about an idea I've had for a few years that I'm developing. And this idea draws on philosophy and logic and law and public policy and social behaviors. And the idea is about change. And more specifically, that we should take a more proactive approach to change rather than being reactionary and looking for excuses or justifications for why we suffer today. So the title is Flipping the Hypothesis. My name is David Kasdan. So the social world, meaning society we live in, is divided. We look at things usually along ends of a spectrum. Male and female, arts and sciences, liberal, conservative, optimistic, pessimistic. And not everything is necessarily clear-cut, one way or the other. Sometimes we have places in between. And the problem is that we often take opinions or have positions and perspectives that we call normative in the social sciences. Normative means what we think should be normal. And so the nature of many political, religious, or other social controversies are these normative debates, and they can get kind of ugly sometimes, and we may have fights and wars and things about them. And so the social world, like I said, is divided. And we may find some sort of opinion that we like, and we'll make a change, and we'll move from one side to the other. And all of these changes, whether we like them or not, are still classified as social progress. They're social progress because they're always happening in time. And what's happened in the past is something that we've experienced, learned from. And even if we don't like it, at least we know we don't like it. And so we're always making progress. Now, this is really a talk about embracing change. Every new experience, as we said, is progress, even if we don't like it. So we may try some kind of food we've never had before. And if it's sour or bitter, well, at least we know. Maybe we go out and we look for a new coat. And we think, boy, I'd like to have this stylish, interesting coat here, rather than the regular plain black wool coat that everybody else wears. Now, these kinds of changes are a little bit risky. Maybe we're going to try something and we'll have this horrible aftertaste. Or we wear this coat and people make fun of us for it. But we have to embrace change because we won't know if it tastes bad or if the coat is embarrassing until we try it. But most of social science, and social science is where I come from, and this is the studying of how people behave in society, most of social science takes on a very conservative and pessimistic kind of approach. Rather than trying something new and making the face, we always try and have the plain rice. Rather than wearing the interesting green coat, perhaps we just always go with the plain black wool coat. This conservative pessimism is a resistance to change. In other words, we're very risk-averse. That means we don't like to take chances sometimes for fear of embarrassment or losing money or making a bad decision. If we buy this strange coat, maybe we'll be cold in the winter, rather than knowing that we'll be warm and snug in our plain black wool coat. Now, I take a little bit of my research from behavioral economics. And behavioral economics gives us some ideas about how we behave. There's a few terms in here. One of them is called risk avoidance. Risk avoidance is saying that, in general, we try not to put ourselves in situations that we don't understand or that might lead to something unexpected. We also have this idea of loss aversion. Loss aversion means that we try not to gamble too much, in other words. Now, of course, some people like to gamble a little bit, but when it comes to the most important big things in life, we tend not to gamble very much. We also have the idea of system justification theory, which is a very complicated way of saying that we defend the way things are because it's familiar to us. Even if we know it's unfair, we find ways to live with it and suffer a little bit. So system justification theory, risk avoidance, loss aversion, all these behavioral tendencies we have tend to resist change because we fear change a little bit sometimes. Now, many famous and important people have discussed change. For instance, we see Galileo here. If we never let Galileo make some changes, or proposed some changes, we would still think the earth is flat. Machiavelli, the statesman, says, I'm not interested in preserving the status quo, I want to overthrow it. Henry Ford says, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. And of course, coming from the last one here, oh, can't see it, but the last quote here says, status quo, is Latin for the mess we're in. That comes from Ronald Reagan, also known as a great conservative statesman. And yet I'm proposing something not conservative. Now, they mention this term status quo. Status quo is a Latin for the way things are, essentially. And the scientific community, social sciences, tend to preserve the way things are. That's this pessimistic conservatism. So the prevailing inertia in social sciences is to resist change, like pulling a donkey, right? And the way that social sciences proposes new ideas is through what's called the hypothesis test. And they state the null hypothesis as the way things are today. And then the alternative hypothesis is the way things could be tomorrow, in very simple terms. So social sciences gives a privileged position to the null hypothesis, to the way things are. And it requires overwhelming proof that the alternative hypothesis, that the change will be beneficial. Now, if you're a conservative, pessimistic person who's learned to live with the way things are pretty comfortably, even if you suffer a little bit, this makes sense. But I don't think that anybody who's here, at least, certainly not at a TED Talk or at a university, is the kind of person who's going to resist change their entire lives. Now, in social sciences, oftentimes they use statistical analysis, to try and determine whether or not we should make a change. And in normal hypothesis testing, they use what's called a normal distribution. The normal distribution here shows that things tend to cluster around the middle. Remember, I used the term normative earlier to mean what's normal. Well, this is normal, average, right? Now, not everybody's average. Of course, not everybody's above average, or not everybody's below average. That can't happen, right? But social sciences are always interested in what happens here, and they're always worried about what happens over on these ends. Now, my idea is that these are the much more interesting places, these ends. We know what's happening here, and if we're not totally satisfied with it, maybe we should spend a little more effort at examining these ends. So normal hypothesis test is a social science mechanism that really defends the status quo. Because the status quo is this part, this middle. Now, social science ideas have to be conservative. Because social scientists, even though many of them are academics, and you think of academics as being liberals who ride bicycles and eat sensibly and things like that, social science academics are very conservative because they're worried about their reputations. They're worried about giving risky claims that might not work, or spending public money on programs that don't work out. And so they have very difficult criteria. The criteria generally is 95% certainty that we don't have some sort of fluke, or 19 out of 20 times the thing has to prove out. Now, that's a very, very high level of certainty. Would any of you do anything if you didn't have 95% certainty? Well, sure you would. You do it every day, right? But for some reason, in the social sciences, when we make changes or propose changes, we demand this very high level of certainty. Otherwise, things just stay how they are. And this inhibits progress. This makes for a very conservative and somewhat boring society. Now, there's some presumptions in this hypothesis test I keep talking about. One of the presumptions, again, is that the null hypothesis has to be basically overthrown. In justice, both in the Korean Constitution as well as the American Constitution and most other civil societies, there's the presumption of innocent until proven guilty. Meaning that if you catch somebody who you believe to be a criminal in the court of law, they're still presumed to be innocent until overwhelming evidence shows them, beyond all reasonable doubt, to be guilty. Now, in social science, the same sort of presumption exists, except that, in this case, the presumption is the way things are now is fine, unless there's overwhelming evidence that there should be a change. Now, this stacks the deck, or makes it very difficult for change. This presumption, again, inhibits change. It's very conservative. Now, we have these ideas about having the glass half empty or half full, or pessimism and optimism. And when social scientists present their ideas, they tend to be pessimistic. Now, this runs completely counter to how science itself, natural science like chemistry, biology, physics runs. Chemistry and biology and physics, natural sciences, they use trial and error. They test something to see if it works. They test many ideas, some of them outrageous, like printing drug delivery methods on pieces of paper, right? So in this natural conservatism, the social sciences actually runs against the prevailing types of scientific methods, which is the trial and error. We don't try very much. Now let me give you an example here. I call this the prisoner's test. If you're at all familiar with economics, they talk about the prisoner's dilemma, or the paradoxes. And this is about how we make decisions about change. Now, in this prisoner's test, here's the standard way to think about it. The null hypothesis is you remain in prison. The alternative hypothesis is to escape prison. Under standard social science procedure, you would follow the null hypothesis. You would remain in prison. And it would take overwhelming evidence for the possibility of success for you to try and escape the prison. But any prisoner is thinking about escape constantly, and hopefully trying. Now, this isn't necessarily advocating prisoners to try to escape all the time, but if, let's say, I'm a wrongly imprisoned person. So, think about this idea here as how a prisoner would behave under the normal hypothesis test situation. I'm proposing flipping this hypothesis test. My proposition is that the null hypothesis is that we make a change for tomorrow. And the alternative hypothesis is that we should stay the way we are. What this means is that every day we should wake up and think, what kind of progress can I make? What can I do to make today a better day than yesterday? In social sciences, we wake up every morning and say, what can we do today to defend how it is? Now, this is the change now. And then the alternative hypothesis would be that we stay the way we are. So the alternative hypothesis would be overwhelming evidence suggesting that I wake up today and do the exact same thing I did yesterday, and the day before, and the day before. And I think that most everybody here would say they would prefer the null hypothesis. So why not put this idea for change, that this notion of social progress, into the default mode, into the way that we approach every situation? Now think again about this prisoner. Now the null hypothesis for the prisoner is escape the prison. And that means that every day they wake up and they think, today I try and escape. I try and make a change for my situation. The alternative hypothesis is to remain in prison. It would take overwhelming evidence for that prisoner to say, I prefer to be in prison today. Maybe outside the prison walls there's sharks or poison thorns or any other kind of thing. But those have got to be preferable risks than staying in prison and knowing the suffering that you have right now. All change has potential. Again, even if you eat something that's sour, or you jump the fence of the prison and run for 2 days before you're caught, it still has potential. You've learned something from it, and you've gone somewhere, and now you know whether or not you don't like that food. You know what's on the other side of the wall. Right? And it makes me think of many scenes in movies where you have a character who's being chased by a car. Right? And I always think to myself, that character is being chased by the car, and he runs right down the middle of the road. You're always going to lose against a car running right down the middle of the road. Why don't they always run to the right or run to the left? Maybe they jump off the bridge into the water, right? Well, I would much rather jump off the bridge and risk swimming in the river than knowing that I'm going to get run down by the car. Now, getting back to the main idea here, is that we should think of social progress as opportunities, and we should have social sciences that push and promote these opportunities. In the business world, we call this continuous improvement. Right? And that means that every time you approach a situation, you always look for a way to do it better, rather than just doing it the same way you always have. And as we see here, in the business world, when you think about change or progress, okay, here's the status quo. And over time, the revenue you get, the benefits of holding the status quo go down. But if you make change, you have what's called a competitive gap. You have an opportunity that you didn't have before. You won't have that if you wake up tomorrow and just do the same thing you did today. Well, unless you come to another TED Talk. That'll be fine. So, again, my main theme is we have to challenge the status quo. We have to challenge the status quo and seek opportunities for social progress and embrace change.